Howdy doody there, everybody. I'm Roger. I'm the world's most average person representing Frontier Theater for YouTube number 4. You know, I've said before that urban legends and stories are very, very important back long ago. And you know, in fact, I was just reading through this book of urban legends about the Ozarks back in the 1700s, and I ran across this neatest little story. And I thought, wow, that is such an awesome story. And I just want to go ahead and just kind of read it to you. But before I was reading that, though, I was reading some of the, about in a magazine that I really like to look at, the Missouri Conservation Magazine. Here we have elk. We had our first elk season last year, another one this year. And we had our first bear season this year, in which we harvested, I think, 12 bears already this year, which is just really quite an accomplishment. Just think, we got bears and elk and otter and all kinds of critters and what have you here in Missouri. And we've got more wildlife today than we did 100 years ago. Okay, let me start reading this little story that I read. And I think it's, as I say, I think it's a really neat story. It's Urban Legends of the Ozarks. Now, this is a story about one of the very first settlers, to be in the Ozarks. He was a Frenchman during the 1700s. And he had a very large family to feed each year, but he was not like other white European settlers who was in the area. He was always thinking about the future. But keep in mind, during the 1700s, life was much different. Remember, there was no stores whatsoever. There was no Walmarts, no shopping centers, no cars, no vehicles. And the only way you had to communicate was maybe with a horn across the valley, or if you could yell really loud, or get on your horse or mule and go walk someplace, or maybe a smoke signal. But that was it. And so in order to have food, you had to grow it, or plant something and eat it, or you had to go out into the woods and harvest something. And now, at that time, game was very plentiful in America, and Missouri also. In fact, many towns have been named after the animals in which the wildlife was even overabundant. Such towns as Deerfield, Missouri, Otterville, Missouri, Elkland, Missouri, and Buffalo, Missouri, and I'm sure there's many others also. Now, this early Frenchman's name was Conci Vashion. Each year, Conci would have a deer drive, and he would force the deer through a choke point. And he had several children. He had 6 boys and 7 girls. But they was always tough and rough. They would, every fall, they would get together on the sides and the end. They would force all those deer through a choke point. And what he had done, he had planted trees about this far apart, and he had put a fence along the side so they couldn't jump over it. And the small deer, like the does and the baby deer, they could go right on through. And then the teenage boys, they could go on through. But however, the big deer, like this, they would get hung up between the trees. Then the boys would go along and harvest enough deer each fall in order to feed their family for all winter long. And they did that every year. Now, Conci Vashion was a very special person once again, and he had the idea, never harvest more deer than what could be replenished so that you have plenty of deer the next year. And so year after year after year, his farm had plenty of deer to harvest, and they never went hungry. And when Conci finally died, his children carried on the same thing on their farm. And pretty soon, people from all over the place got to calling them the conservationists. And so perhaps Conci Vashion was our very first conservationist, in which he knew the value of harvesting so many deer each year, but not over-harvesting so it would constantly be replenished. And today, we have the Missouri Conservation Magazine that we take every month, and I read it. I love this magazine. It's all about animals and, just anything you can think of. It's just, the pictures are beautiful, the authors that write the stories are awesome, and just, you know, and here we have an example right here about, oh, let's see, here's one here, let me see if I can find, oh yeah, isn't that a beautiful picture of the elk? This makes our second year to have elk hunting season here in Missouri. And then we had another one about youth hunting. You've got youth hunting, youth fishing here in Missouri, but in Missouri has done an excellent job of being able to harvest deer each year, but not overdoing it, so there's plenty for the future. And so thus lives the legacy of Conci Vashion, and known as the conservationist. And that's where we got today, the conservationist. So if you're a conservationist, just remember the urban legend on who started it. Thank you so much. And this is our last video for this week on behalf of YouTube. And we'll see you next week. We're going to talk about old-fashioned schools. Thank you. And remember to subscribe.